Right. For most of the time since its political separation from mainland Normandy in 1204, the population of Jersey more or less stayed around about 20,000. It was a self-contained community. Largely French refugees who came to live here were just quietly accepted. As far as everyday life was concerned, linguistically, islanders spoke Jersey Norman French, or Jersiais, which was essentially a spoken language, and carried out official business in good French. In the same way that people in England spoke their local dialects but carried out official business in good English. This all changed, of course, with the French Revolution. A Royal Navy squadron was based here, and a large number of English-speaking troops came here permanently. We'll not mention the Russians. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1850, the island experienced an influx of English speakers, and the resident population of Jersey shot up to about 50,000 within a generation. To about 1850, there's 50,000 people here. And this has led to an increasing Englishness in Jersey society. New houses in St Helier were built in the English style. 1834, an English-style currency superseded the local currency. For the next 43 years, mind, there were 13 pennies in the shilling, not 12 like anybody sensible to do. Jersey's traditional weights and measures were gradually being supplanted by the English weights and measures. Families who'd been in the island for centuries began emigrating to the colonies in search of a better life, and they were being replaced by mainlanders. It must have seemed in the mid-19th century the island's identity was under threat. Of course, this isn't unique. People like to think so, but isn't. People in England felt that their regional cultures were being eroded by industrialisation, urbanisation, growing bureaucratic centralisation, and even the beginning of universal education. All over the country, like-minded people were gathering together to form antiquarian societies to study the history and organise lectures and activities centred on their respective regions. And they often collected relevant articles and shoved them in a local museum. The oldest of these regional societies in England is the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle upon Tyne, 1813. Began publishing its academic journal, the Archaeologia Iliana, in 1822. Its interest was obviously sparked off by the presence of the Roman wall, which you can't miss, but it rapidly expanded to cover the history and archaeology, and intriguingly, the industrial archaeology of the northeast. It hardly started, but they're studying it. And from my perspective, interestingly, the traditional music of the region. Perhaps inspired by these societies, a public meeting was held in St Helier on the 18th of January 1873, and after which 10 Jerseymen, led by William Lawrence de Gruchy and Gervais Le Gros, who believed passionately in the study of the island's history, language, its monuments, historical sites, decided that a society should be formed. 10 days later, there was a second meeting, and they decided that they were going to prepare the regulations governing this new body. 10 weeks later, they adopted the regulations, and on 23rd of April 1873, an executive committee was set up and elected. The elected head was Jurat Durel Lerrier. Rule number 2 sets out that the Society's main aim was to study the history, language and antiquities of the island and their conservation, as well as the publication of historical documents. An island society had been divided politically, sometimes quite vehemently, for the previous 100 years. And so rule number 3 states the Société is to be outside any partisanship and has no political significance. By the end of that year, 1873, the Société claims 3 honorary members, 68 subscribing members, and by the time the first annual report's published, 2 years later, it's gone up to 83 members. So the question is, why did it really take until 1873 for this to happen? And I think in a way, it's because it's a reaction to Jersey's establishment to the creeping anglicisation of the island, and they're holding a mirror to themselves. At the same time, they're basking in the reality of Britain's success as the most formidable power on earth. Society was beginning to place a greater importance on education. For centuries, the better-off members of Jersey society, the boys, had been taught at the old grammar schools, St Anastase and St Manelier, while their sisters tended to get a limited education at home. This changes in 1852 when Victoria College opens in St Helier. and this offers boys an English-style education. Takes another generation before the girls get the same benefit, mind. This, of course, only applies to the more affluent members of society, those who could pay. However, with the increased mechanisation, there's now a need for an educated, literate workforce, and so the states begin a review of elementary education in the island. And in 1871, a Comité d'Éducation Élémentaire is set up, and they make a crucially important decision, because the size of Jersey, they can't do it by themselves, so they adopt the principles of English elementary education. And in order to do this, they have to import English inspectors. They also have to decide what language the children are going to be taught. The island's a linguistic hodgepodge. Standardised French and standardised English are being used in commerce and the church, the courts, the newspapers, while Jersiais is commonly used in the country. And of course the debate is going to be heavily influenced by this economic influence of having to bring inspectors from the English system. And so it's decided that English is going to be the language of instruction in Jersey schools. And once that happens, it's inevitable that that the island's going to become part of the English-speaking world. And by the time education becomes compulsory in 1899, every islander has to speak English at least some of the time. And by the following year, 1900, the new century, English is allowed as the language of debate in the States. When the regulations of the Société were drawn up, 1873, rule number 8 stipulates, and I'll say this in English because my French is atrocious, the books, minutes and other documents of the Société shall be drawn up in the French language, and all discussions, as far as possible, shall be conducted in that language. So by this, I think we can see that despite what's popularly regarded today, it's French, that good French, that the fledgling Société is interested in preserving rather than Société. The Jersiais section only begins in May 1995, and the first bit of Jersiais I can find published in the Société Bulletin only appears in 1936 when Frank Lemaiche's poem on the flowers, of the names of the local flowers, appears. 3 committees were set up to reflect the Société's original purpose: archaeology, language and history. Within 3 years they'd been joined by a 4th, the Museum and Natural History Committee. Committees get changed to sections in 1914. The first bulletin is published in 1875, and since then it's been the chief vehicle for members to present the results of their research. Interestingly, the first article in the 1876 bulletin is written entirely in English. Many of these articles have been about island families, the military situation of the island, the involvement in the island's overseas trade, and as the number and interest of the sections grew, natural history, geology, ornithology. And while the articles were submitted in both French and English, it's only in 1945 that the business reports appear in English. So that's the background from the Société emerges. And so what's the quality of the research? Well, from my perspective, it's been excellent, some's been mediocre, some's been particularly dodgy. Some have been incisive, some has been overly patriotic, some has been self-congratulatory. Some articles have been written extremely well and some have been rather tedious. But the thing I've found out, as far as the history articles are concerned, they've all been of interest. And they reflect the thinking of that time, and the emphasis has largely, over the last 150 years, been on the great and the good and the military issues. In 1988, in David Lowenthal's book, The Past is a Foreign Country, he wrote, "Memory, history, relics of earlier times shed light on the past. But the past they reveal is not simply what happened. It's to a certain extent a past of our own creation, moulded by selective erosion, oblivion, intervention, and despite cultural amnesia, there's grown up a cult of nostalgia, preservation and a search for roots." And I think it's this creation of the past that I find interesting. And when I was asked to do the talk, I toyed with the idea of going through the achievements of the organisation, but I thought, can't be bothered with that. What I'm going to do, I just want to present a bit of a challenge and ask, are we in danger of using the past as a comfort zone to validate ourselves, to broadcast our credentials? Because in the last decade or so, what I've noticed is an increase, and this is outside the society, I'll add here, it's been increasing what's been termed presentism, judging historical figures and events by today's morality. And I believe this is dangerous because it ignores the true complexity of human nature. Unlike us, people in the past didn't know what was going to come next. And this has been accompanied by growing demand in certain areas for apologies to be given, for actions taken in the past, for all sorts of things. It might be an unpopular view at the moment, but I don't believe that people of the past owe anybody an apology. And we can acknowledge what happened in the past, but as been said, like us, the people in the past emerged from the womb into a society that, like all societies around the world, had pre-existing customs and mores. Presented with this, they simply played the cards that God dealt them in the best way they knew how, and that's all you can expect of them. History isn't a safe place. It doesn't care what you think about things. You're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And those facts don't cease to exist simply because you ignore them. However, when it's presented to us, history is also there to be challenged. I've always found history to be fascinating. It's often been said that history is all around us. We simply need to look and have an inquiring mind. And everybody's interested in history, not necessarily the stuff that's shoved at you at school. I was never particularly interested in 19th century sewage problems, but I had to learn it. History, of course, we're all interested in something, and that something has a history. A history that can be specific, it can have local association, have wider implications. It can be long-term, it can be short-term, it can be military, political, economic, social. It can be the story of the great and the good, or it can be the story of the common man. What history does, it explains the world around us. It gives us value and meaning of the present and a realistic sense of a shared past. It's what makes us a nation. It's who we are and why we are the way that we are. However, it is also a dangerous place when it's manipulated and not challenged. A few years ago, there was a very famous advertising campaign on television. The advert shows a small boy pushing a delivery bicycle up a very steep cobbled road, and everything's shot in sepia. And there's an emotive soundtrack provided by a brass band. The small boy gets home, he's received into the bosom of the family in a warm, welcoming kitchen, and he's given a slice of bread and butter. This is the past like we'd like to live in. It's the rural idyll that was presented in the classic British films like Mrs. Miniver and History of Mr. Polly. The Welsh word the Welsh have a word for it, hireth. It doesn't translate into English very easily. It's often described as meaning a deep longing or a nostalgia for a place or a time that may never have existed. Or it might only have existed in one's memory or imagination. It brings together the feeling of homesickness, nostalgia, longing. Hireth is a pull on the heart, and it conveys a distinct feeling of missing something. It's irretrievably lost. In Jersey, I think temps passé actually brings that same feeling. And of course, history, as I said, isn't a safe place. If you give this advertisement any more than a passing thought, what should hit us on reflection is that this is the past on a superficial level. What the advertiser didn't want to ask is why the small boy was working at all. And the reality of the portrayed unspecified age for the working class was actually one of disease, poverty, exploitation, deprivation on such a scale that the government of the UK was forced to intervene and create the beginnings of the welfare state. Would it have been as powerful if the young boy was consumptive and had to hand over all his wages to his mother to supplement the family income? Would the advert have generated such a rosy glow if there'd been a realisation that the slice of bread and butter was the boy's entire meal? And that's one of the problems of the past. There's a tendency to create an image of the past, of a time when life was simpler. It's seductive and selective. We're tempted to use it the same way as toddlers use teddy bears and blankets to surround ourselves with a fixed point for security and comfort. And as we all know, life in the past was just as contradictory, as complex as it is today. It may have been different, but it was just the same. The people in the past had their own values, needs, desires in the same way as we do today. There may have been different values, different needs, different desires, but they're just as important. And are we guilty of simplifying their life? Here in Jersey, I believe that over the years we have, as a community, adopted an acceptable version of the past in which to regale visitors and residents, a past that fits comfortably with our idea of identity. I don't think that we're alone in this. National myths of shared pasts are important. However, I do think we've been guilty of ignoring the uncomfortable parts of the past. no matter how much one would like something to be true, we're still dependent on facts. But sadly, we live in an age where many people have no interest in facts or history, just in their own mythology and grievance. It could refer to the issue of collaboration during the occupation as an example of the uncomfortable parts of the past. But I think a better example would be the current fascination with something I've been looking at for the past 20 years, slavery. The comfortable view is that Jersey wasn't involved in transatlantic slave trade. It was a nasty business, and not being part of it allows us to feel good about ourselves. However, it's incomprehensible that islanders wouldn't have participated in what was such a lucrative trade. And at the time, it was regarded as totally legal and respectable. We now know that islanders were involved in the slave trade. To what extent, we're still exploring, but definitely the hints were there, but they're just ignored. And of course, we're focusing on it. 1982 Bulletin, John Stevens and Jean Arthur wrote an article about the St. Martinet family. Fine historians were the war, and despite stating the most interesting and valuable of these documents is a group of letters written from Jamaica in 1668, 70, 77 and 83. The letters brag about plantations, building sugar mills. They totally ignore the mention of the word slave is not mentioned, because in the 1980s the transatlantic slave trade wasn't of interest. And actually sum up and say, from these letters we gain the impression of a family who emigrated and through their own resources and hard work became prosperous in Jamaica, but who retained a deep affection for their relatives in Jersey and a keenness to employ Jerseymen and keep up trade with their native island.
Would you conclude now?
Yeah. So the point about students of history is that what we want to do, our guiding star should be the past as a relevant factor in the present. And we are ruled in the past. Nobody really understands it. But I like to use the analogy of a coral island that is a little piece peeking above the surface, but underneath there's all these dead skeletons. And so we are ruled and conditioned by what we never see and by what most of us never think about. And the things from the past decide nearly everything in our lives, but they're usually accepted without question. And it's important that we question. History is the most powerful intellectual tool that society possesses. Its purpose is to explain the present. It's there to say why we live in the world that we live in. It tells us what's important. It could be said that the future lies in the past, for whoever controls the past shapes the world that we live. And it's a frightening thought. And when you look at certain events, look at the Bosnian-Serbian conflict, look what's going on in Ukraine, smash the museums, smash the archives, you deprive the people of their past. You then control the narrative. Now they're the questions that
You're having to conclude.
I think is important. The great Irish folk song collector Frank Hart wrote, "Those in power write the history, while those suffer in silence write the songs." The question I want to finish with is dead simple. For the working class, traditional music, traditional songs were the theatre. It was how people gathered the news, it's how they found out about around the world. It found out what happened in Jersey. Where's the traditional music gone? Where's the traditional songs gone? What happened? What happened in Jersey that destroyed all that? I don't know.